Okay. Well, I guess kind of like springboarding off of being queer and being in the creative space. I was wondering if we could go, way back to the beginning of your career. Were you always interested in working in the creative space? I think you hinted at that. And how was your perception of working in creativity back then in the workforce?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. I think from a very, very young age, I always wanted to craft stories. I always wanted to take the elements of story that were around me and manipulate them. So I was writing stories early. I was writing poetry very early. Now, in terms of being a writer, this was an unheard of thing because I am the first person. I'm a first generation university attendee myself. I had one older cousin who went to university, but in terms of like going through and being a part of that world, being part of any kind of creative economy or any university world, were both something far outside the experience of the people that I grew up with. My grandfather was a fisherman. My relatives are all working somehow in the resource economy in small town Nova Scotia. So there was no arts really, music, culture, really anything like that around me. But what I did have were really great storytellers. So these same uncles who were fishermen, these aunties who were, maybe working in the home, had grown up with story as a part of the fabric of everyday life and the manipulation of story. So I had that in my back pocket and I started to write. When I went to Halifax, I actually got a scholarship to go to journalism because they went, oh, you can write things. Here's how you make money writing things. And so I went to King's for journalism and thought that I would go that route because I was very passionate about things like the environment, even early. I was, a Greenpeacer very early, macrobiotic. I sort of saw lots of things that were askew and what we would now call system changes. I didn't know that I would, I didn't know they would be called that in my time, but I knew that the ways that we were using the planet were not good ways. And I wanted to use my words and my kind of skills to change that. So I thought journalism would be a great path. What I discovered though, once I got there, I did audition for a play. And I realized that I was leaning less toward factual reporting and more toward how can I take the elements of story and rejuggle them. Because the world as I saw it, I had this big imbalance between the world as I wanted it to be and the world as I saw it in front of me. And the only place I could remedy that was on the page. So if you do conventional and then even jumping ahead a little bit, when I started to audition for plays and went to theater school, they wanted to cast me in ingenue parts. They wanted to put me in Neil Simon plays where I had to cry because my husband didn't like the wallpaper. And I was like, what the actual hell? Like, I can't even touch that in my reality. I wanted sort of characters who were like me, who had different gender, whose thoughts and dreams and desires were bigger than wallpaper or bigger than curtains. And so people started saying to me, okay, maybe you better write them then. If you're not being cast in the roles that you want to play, maybe you should write them. And so that's what brought me more into writing and less into performing. I started, drifted kind of away from wanting to be auditioning because auditioning for roles as a film actress or a film actor has it all those systems of power baked right into it. And I think it's become a lot better now as a queer or a trans person to go into an audition. But at the time when I did it, it was absolutely still um, pretty much verboten. It was the thinking at the time was you had to suppress any specific iteration of gender in order to be universal. But what universal meant is hyper femme, which was not, I just wasn't interested. I was kind of like, that's not me, and I don't want to inhabit that body or those parts. Um, so I guess the kind of drive to make cultural products that were more interesting came at me from the performance angle, from being involved in live theater, and just wanting to change the world. So I never really thought. Nobody told me that if I started writing short stories or plays or poems, that I would have a fulsome financial career handed to me. I kind of knew it would be a hustle. I kind of knew that I'd have to figure out what the world wanted and go out there and get it as a working class person. So I guess that's what I did. That's maybe one of the reasons I write for so many different genres instead of just sticking to one. Um, It's like, figure out where's the need and what can I do.
Yeah, I think the hustle is real, and understood for all
Absolutely.
for all creatives. But I think it's great that you kind of combine your knowledge and your passion for understanding different systems and systemic issues that you've observed with your passions for writing and creativity. And so curiously, like, how did your queer identity sort of evolve with your creativity? Was it something that had you had always intended to have a presence in your writing, in your poetry, or is it something that inadvertently kind of just came naturally to you?
I would say it came naturally, and I put it in pieces very early. I started to write pieces and send them out. Now, what I did notice very early in my career is that the things, because not every piece outs you. Some pieces, just by the nature of it, right? You don't end up using a pronoun because the poem doesn't call for it. I was like, wow, how odd. The stuff that isn't forthrightly queer seems to get picked up and published, and the stuff that actually uses she, or declares to, if it's a poem about love, it declares to, love toward a woman, and own and sort of names that, not because I felt like I was censoring myself, but because the market was censoring me. I did notice that, and I was kind of like, damn, that sucks. That sucks. Because I didn't really stop myself from writing it. I wrote everything and sent out everything, but I did notice that it was much more difficult to place a script with a queer character in it than a character who was whose affiliation or whose romantic desires were not named. Some scripts just don't name it because the script is not about that. They don't go there. So that was something that I did notice. Now, in terms of the what I bring to cultural spaces that I'm part of, I know that my queer identity has informed almost everything. Like when it came to things like um, disability studies, when it came to things like crip studies, I kind of I don't inhabit that space. I don't identify as a disabled person. But when I saw people bringing that discourse, I was like, yeah, I can step back. I can give space for that. And the same with racism, with people naming racism. Because I had that in my back pocket, that I have some lived experience in terms of what it's like to be pushed aside or silenced as a queer person. I just said to myself, that's not going to happen to anybody as long in the space that I am facilitating or controlling, or helping to control. I will not allow that to happen if I can not let that happen. So queering a space to me means making it friendly and making it as accessible to somebody for reasons of ability, for reasons of race, for reasons of how they grew up. Access to the learning space or access to the creative space is something that I know my little queer self remembers. What's that like to be pushed out, and then I bring it. And so we're not always coming at it from queer, but we're always coming at it from what I know you and I have talked about this, Mark, that it's brave space. It's like safe space, but it's also brave space. And that's always been really important to me, informed early by by being a queer person and a queer creative, but then also informed more recently by my family. I'm part of a two mom biracial family. My son is a biracial person, and those things are super key to me. And also like indigenous rights, when that comes forward, it's like, yes, I'm not going to speak, I'm going to hold space, but it feels familiar to me what the folks are trying to articulate.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think in many circumstances, when it comes to sensitive discussions, uh, I think people have just come around to really valuing lived experience and how that can be an incredibly important tool to empathize with other people who may not have like a one for one struggle, but we as queer people, we can understand, like you said, feeling like the other, being pushed aside. And so yeah, that's being queer, and being in the LGBT community has allowed me, certainly in my research, to understand that there are people who feel like, by their own identity, they don't feel like they belong. And I think that's incredibly important to realize that, you know, we need to be more sensitive to other people's lives and their lived experiences and understanding their circumstances, so that when we uh, try to search for a solution, we make it truly inclusive. So I'm also interested in any queer role models that you've had throughout your life
Mhm.
and career.
Right. Um, yeah, I mean, there's lots of literary folks that I would look to, and like somebody like Clarice Lispector, who's a South American writer who articulated, and also Hélène Sixou, who's a French writer. They articulated very early, coming out of the French and South American traditions, what I call écriture féminine. So they placed a value on writing that came from outside the cis white het male perspective. So that was one literary kind of stream that I latched onto super early as a reader. The work of Virginia Woolf and the way that she plays with gender in Orlando, which was sort of both valuable, brave, but also playful. Like in Orlando, she just goes, gender's not a thing, or it's a thing, but it's up for grabs. And that really connected with me in terms of play, because I've always been somebody who, it's like, if I can't, I need to laugh. That's how I survive. And so I loved her sense of, we know that there's gendered violence, we know there's gendered power, but at the same time, to find one little corner of it that you can laugh at it is so valuable for people. So those are some literary kind of role models that I found. On a personal level, I was really lucky I had gay uncles. There were gay uncles that were a generation behind me. One of them, really important to me, was a member of the bear community in Halifax. And I just got to know that culture, their body positivity. They were a real touchstone for me throughout my young queer life. I could both see that my uncle, who had faced incredible hardship by being that generation ahead, and also by being a man in a rural space, and all the responsibility that's heaped on you in terms of trying to be a man, being forced to be a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of man. I saw the impact that had on him, but I also got to be a part of his bear community and see that, like, that was a real place of healing for people. So I had that in a personal way. And then I was really lucky, like on the Canadian scene, we were really lucky to host a few years ago JD Derbyshire, who was our writer in residence. And JD, again, is like a little bit, like a little bit ahead of me career wise, but a queer artist who also, absolutely puts to the first and foremost, like anti-racism. She advocates for folks who are neurodiverse, who are differently abled. She brings kind of all the goodness of what I see as a queer artist to bear in her practice, and she's so ethical and consequent. In fact, the notion of the brave space, that's from a workshop that I took from JD. And so I got to really connect one-on-one when JD came to campus. So that's one of the Canadian kind of role models, I would say. Like the bar that JD sets is super high. So I feel lucky to have had lots of queer elders. And now, not to sort of thrust myself there, because I'm kind of teetering on that. I don't know, I just turned 50. So I'm feeling, that I want to be that, or be part of that chain. We all need mentors and mentees. And I think that's been very difficult in queer history. There's a huge impetus to push us back in the closet. There's also sometimes, unfortunately, a huge impetus for us to fight with one another. Like there can be infighting in queer communities, there can be exclusion. We can't overlook those differences, and the differences need to be articulated, and the violences need to be pointed out. But I am all for any kind of celebratory, multi-generational queerness. And that's something I consciously try to bring to my work. Is like, can I celebrate a queer elder, or can I reach out to a young queer person and be like a part of that chain, so that our history doesn't keep getting buried? Because I think that happens.